pretty much all we need. Did I just get in a car wreck? What just happened? Oh my gosh, the brakes.
Derek Bieri's father died before he ever got to see the empire his son would build. Then Derek made one decision he would spend the next 11 years trying to undo. He sold his father's 1956 Buick Special. Millions of people watch him revive dead engines every week, but this was the one thing he couldn't bring back with a wrench. Why did Derek let the last piece of his father slip away? And why did it take so long to finally get it back? Join us as we uncover the real heartbreak behind Vice Grip Garage's Derek Bieri.
Oh, welcome back. This week, the fine fellers and fellettes at O'Reilly want to help you better understand some vice grip vocabulators and find me some make it happeners for my going to town rigs. So let's give them a call.
The suit he walked away from. Derek Bieri spent over 15 years wearing a uniform nobody would recognize him in today. A suit, a tie, a title, and a corner office he had earned. He climbed high enough in the corporate world to hold titles like president and vice president at multiple companies, the kind of resume most people spend their whole careers chasing. On paper, Derek had made it. In reality, something in him was starving. He had grown up on a 1,200-acre farm in northwestern North Dakota, right at the edge of Canada, where his father, his grandfather, and a rotating cast of uncles treated broken machinery like a puzzle rather than an inconvenience. There were no auto parts stores nearby, or quick fixes waiting a phone call away. If something broke, you found the closest scrap of usable metal in 100 years of accumulated farm junk and made it work. Derek's father once yanked the small block Chevy engine clean out of the family truck in the middle of harvest season, dropped it into a dying combine to save the crop, then put it back in the truck once the job was done. Nobody filmed it or clapped. For them, it was just another Tuesday on the Bieri farm. That upbringing followed Derek into boardrooms he never quite belonged in. He climbed the ladder anyway, because that's what a driven farm kid with something to prove does. But the higher he climbed, the more he noticed something missing. The satisfaction of fixing something with his own two hands and watching it come back to life. Meetings didn't scratch that itch. Spreadsheets definitely didn't. One night, almost on a whim, Derek taped a broken iPhone to his garage door, wedged a small block and a 4-speed transmission into an old Camaro, and started filming himself trying to bring it back from the dead. He wasn't launching a business, and he'd be the first to tell you it wasn't exactly professional. To this day, he still warns anyone tuning in that what they're about to watch isn't necessarily educational. He was just scratching an old itch in the only language he really spoke fluently: rust, bolts, and stubbornness. It shouldn't have worked. A guy with no certification, script, and a busted iPhone camera had no business competing with polished automotive television. But something about watching a real person struggle and eventually win against a 40-year-old engine block kept people watching. Vice Grip Garage found its first few thousand viewers, then a few 100,000, then millions. Derek didn't just leave the corporate world behind. He traded it for something his father would have actually understood. Success brought its own strange problems. Years later, Derek and his wife, Jessica Bieri, packed up the whole operation and moved the family from Minnesota to Tennessee. And for a while, the internet lost its mind trying to figure out why. Fans assumed the worst: a falling out, a financial collapse. Maybe the show was quietly winding down. Derek was just tired of Minnesota winters costing him 3 to 4 months of shop time every single year. Tired of watching his own breath while trying to film underneath a car. Jessica wanted a different kind of childhood for their sons. Tennessee had no state income tax and a shorter drive to the car shows that kept the lights on. It was a farm kid doing exactly what his father always did, solving a practical problem the practical way, and not much caring how it looked from the outside. By the time the suits were gone for good, Derek had built an entirely new identity out of the one skill nobody in a boardroom ever asked him about. He had spent over a decade proving himself in rooms that never quite fit, only to find his real audience in a garage that did. But leaving one life behind didn't mean Derek was done being tested in public. If anything, the bigger his channel grew, the bigger a target he became whenever things went wrong that weren't even his fault. And in the summer of 2026, something went wrong in a very public way, forcing Derek to make a choice that said everything about the man that corporate life never managed to change. The blame he didn't have to take.
And we lost thousands in product and materials and parts. Pretty much everything that's sitting on the floor was either damaged or is no longer usable.
On May 30th, 2026, the city of Tulsa set out to make history. Organizers planned a Guinness World Records attempt for the largest parade of classic cars ever assembled, tied to the Route 66 Capitol Cruise, and they wanted Derek there front and center. He agreed to serve as Grand Marshal, standing shoulder to shoulder with Oklahoma's Lieutenant Governor and Tulsa's own mayor, lending his name and his massive following to help pull the event off. More than 5,000 people registered their classic cars for the cruise, some of them driving hundreds of miles and spending money they didn't necessarily have to spare just to be part of something historic. Attendance ended up more than doubling what organizers originally expected, largely because Derek's audience showed up in force to be part of it. Then, the wheels came off, almost literally. Traffic control at the staging area buckled under the sheer number of cars trying to get in. Roughly 1,400 registered, credentialed drivers found themselves stuck in gridlock for hours, watching the clock tick past the cutoff time organizers needed to protect the world record attempt. Eventually, event staff made a brutal call: cap the parade and turn away anyone who hadn't made it to the line in time. People who'd sacrificed money, time, and vacation days were suddenly told to turn around and go home instead. The backlash was immediate and furious. Fans flooded social media, accusing organizers of mismanaging one of the biggest classic car events the state had ever attempted. And in the middle of the outrage sat Derek, a man who hadn't been in charge of a single traffic cone that day, but whose name and face had helped sell out the entire event in the first place. He could have stayed quiet. Plenty of public figures in his position would have. Instead, Derek posted publicly that he was deeply saddened, completely gutted, and genuinely embarrassed that thousands of people had been turned away at the gate. He pointed out that since certain parties refused to take responsibility, he would take it himself, acknowledging that his own promotion had helped swell attendance far past what anyone had planned for. He didn't stop there. Derek later told local reporters he had attended hundreds of car shows across the country and Canada, and had never once witnessed traffic control handled that badly. He warned that other major car events were already reconsidering whether Tulsa deserved their business going forward, predicting real economic damage to the small businesses that depended on events like this one. He named numbers: 3 separate events already pulling out of Tulsa because of what he'd seen, with more, he suspected, waiting to follow. For a city banking on Route 66's centennial to drive tourism for years to come, that kind of warning from car culture's most trusted voice landed hard. It took Derek's public pressure to get there. Only after his statement went viral did Visit Tulsa issue a formal apology and confirm refunds for every driver who'd checked in, but never made it onto the route. Tulsa got its Guinness World Record in the end, but it got the apology and the refunds because Derek refused to let the story end at the gate. Nobody would have blamed him for staying quiet. He didn't stay quiet. That instinct didn't start in Tulsa. It started on a farm most of his audience will never see, with a man Derek hasn't been able to call in a very long time. What his father left him. Long before Derek Bieri became a face millions of strangers recognized, he was simply a small boy on a North Dakota farm, watching his father solve problems most people would have declared unsolvable. His father wasn't a certified mechanic. Neither was his grandfather. What they had instead was decades of forced creativity, born out of living somewhere too remote for convenience. One memory sat at the center of everything Derek carried forward. His father owned a 1956 Buick Special, a car that would eventually become the first vehicle Derek ever truly remembered from his own childhood. One night, with a parade scheduled for the very next morning, his father found himself racing against the clock, rushing to finish a paint job on that Buick in a dirt-floor garage lit by nothing more than whatever bulbs they had hanging overhead. Derek, barely old enough to understand what was happening, rode circles around his father on a small plastic tricycle the entire time, blissfully unaware that he was kicking up dust straight into the wet paint with every lap. His father didn't stop him. He just kept working, determined that the car would look right by morning no matter what obstacles, including his own son, got thrown in his way. That single night stayed with him longer than almost any other memory from that garage. Derek's father taught him mechanics the same way his own father had taught him, hands-on, with real consequences attached. There were no do-overs when a harvest was on the line. The same resourcefulness that once saved a harvest wasn't dramatic to anyone living it. It was just how the Bieri family survived out there, generation after generation. Derek absorbed every bit of it, not as formal education, but as identity. He learned to trust his hands over instruction manuals, to see a rusted, forgotten machine, and imagine it running again rather than accept it as scrap. Every single skill that would eventually make Vice Grip Garage a hit had already been fully formed in him decades before a camera ever captured it. And then, at some point along the way, Derek's father passed away. His father's death never made a headline. It didn't need to. It just left a gap that Derek carried into every job, every engine, every mile of highway that came after. Derek never got to show his father the channel that grew into an empire, never got to hand him a business card from a Netflix deal or a television show. And somewhere in the years after, one object kept pulling at him harder than anything else he owned. A car that still smelled, in his memory, exactly like his father's garage. Life got difficult enough that Derek made a decision he'd spend the next 11 years regretting. He sold that Buick. 11 years for one car. Derek didn't sell his father's Buick because he stopped caring about it. He sold it during a difficult stretch of his own life, the kind most people go through at some point, when an old car sitting in a garage starts to look, on paper, like an asset instead of a memory. Except it wasn't just an asset, and Derek knew it the moment the sale was final. He had let go of the one physical object left in the world that still connected him directly to his father's own two hands. Every scratch in that paint, every quirk in that Dynaflow transmission that topped out around 30 miles an hour, carried a memory Derek could never buy back at any price, and yet he'd just sold it for exactly that, a price. He never stopped thinking about it. For over a decade, that Buick lived somewhere out in the world without him, passed from owner to owner, drifting further from the Bieri family with every year that ticked by. Derek didn't have the luxury of simply hiring someone to track it down. he had to actually find it. The same patient, stubborn way his father had once found solutions to problems nobody else could solve. Piece by piece, lead by lead, refusing to accept that it was simply gone for good. 11 years after selling it, Derek finally located the Buick again, sitting in Texas, far from the cold northern farm where it first learned to run. He didn't arrange to have it shipped home safely on a trailer. He drove down, bought it back, and decided to bring it home himself. The same 1,500-mile trip in reverse that had first carried his family's history south all those years earlier. The trip nearly broke the car apart before it ever got him home. A wheel bearing groaned dangerously the entire way. A U-joint threatened total failure with every mile. The engine flirted with overheating more than once, forcing Derek to nurse it along rather than simply put his foot down and hope for the best. At one particularly rough stretch, cameras caught him visibly disappointed, staring down a mechanical problem he hadn't planned for, forced to make a difficult creative call just to keep the Buick moving at all. It would have been easy to give up somewhere along that highway. It wasn't easy. It just wasn't an option Derek was willing to consider, not with this particular car, not after everything it took to find it in the first place. When the Buick finally rolled back onto Bieri family land, Derek's grandmother was there to see it arrive. She hadn't just lost a son years earlier. She'd also quietly watched that Buick disappear once already, sold off along with whatever piece of her own son it still carried inside it. Seeing it return, engine running, paint intact after everything it had been through, broke something open in her that had clearly been sealed shut for a very long time. She cried at the sight of it, watching a piece of her late son come home in the only form it possibly could. Derek had spent 11 years trying to fix something he could never actually fix. His father was still gone. Nothing about that changed the moment the Buick's tires touched North Dakota dirt again. But for one afternoon, standing next to a car his father had once stayed up all night to finish, Derek got about as close to bringing him back as anyone in his position ever could. That afternoon answered one question Derek had been chasing for over a decade. It also raised a much bigger one. What do you do with everything you've rebuilt, once the one thing you were rebuilding it for is finally home? What Derek actually built. People tune into Vice Grip Garage every week expecting to watch Derek revive machines nobody else believed were worth saving. Few of them realize they're actually watching the aftermath of a much smaller, much more personal rescue mission that happened off camera, years before any of this made him famous. Somewhere along the way, the guy with the taped-on iPhone ended up with his own television show. Roadworthy Rescues premiered on Motor Trend in 2022, and by then, Vice Grip Garage itself had racked up hundreds of millions of views, built entirely on the same instinct his father handed him for free on a North Dakota farm. Nothing rusted out is actually finished. It's just waiting on somebody stubborn enough to disagree. Networks don't usually hand a show to a man with no formal training and no script. But Derek had already spent a lifetime proving that credentials were never really the point. The point was always whether the thing ran by the end of the video and whether the person standing over it refused to walk away before it did. Derek still has his brothers, Chris and Sean, and together, the three of them still make the trip back to North Dakota when the farm calls for it. Not long ago, that pull brought Derek home again, this time chasing down his grandfather's old 1946 Ford grain truck, sitting exactly where it had been left decades earlier, waiting for someone patient enough to get it running in time to actually haul grain again. His father wasn't there for that one either. He hadn't been there for a long time. But the truck ran anyway, because Derek and his brothers still work the same way their father taught them to. Find what's usable, ignore what people say is impossible, and get it moving again. Even Tulsa, in its own way, circled back to the same farm. Derek didn't cause that gridlock any more than a 10-year-old causes a harvest to fail. But both times, he was the one who stayed and did something about it anyway. A boardroom would have called that someone else's problem. A farm never lets anyone off that easy, and neither, it turns out, did Derek. Derek never got the ending most people quietly hope for. One more conversation, one more chance to show his father what all those lessons eventually built. What he got instead was 11 years, one battered Buick, and every rusted-out project he still refuses to give up on, each one carrying his father's fingerprints somewhere underneath the paint. Do you think grief pushes people to rebuild everything around them? Or does it just teach them how to hide it better behind success? If you had 11 years to chase down one thing connecting you to someone you lost, would you have quit long before Derek did? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.